The morning arrived thin and pale, carrying the smell of frost and sage across the valley, and Mara stood alone at the far fence where the land dipped toward the river. She had learned to arrive before the others, before opinions hardened the air, because dawn was the only hour that did not ask her to explain herself. Her boots pressed quiet signatures into the soil, and the quiet steadied her breathing. Beyond the fence, the wild stallion lifted his head, dark mane catching light like a struck match, eyes sharp as flint. He had been there for weeks, half rumor, half threat, and entirely unresolved. Mara had come to the ranch to prove something she could never name aloud. The men called her careful when they meant timid, and the women smiled with a distance that felt practiced. She did the work, all of it, and did it well, yet respect slid past her as if she were made of glass. The stallion, they said, was the final test. He had broken 2 gates and a wrist. He refused ropes, refused grain, refused the language of command. To them, he was a problem waiting to become a spectacle. To her, he looked like a question asked by the earth itself. She stopped 3 fence posts away, because distance was a courtesy. The stallion did not step back. He breathed once, heavy and measured, steam lifting like a brief confession. Mara let her hands rest at her sides. She had learned that hands were the first betrayal, promising what the heart could not keep. She listened instead to the small noises that revealed intention. The shift of weight, the scrape of hoof, the warning sigh before flight. The wind threaded between them, carrying her scent, carrying his heat, braiding the moment into something that could not be rushed. Behind her, the ranch woke. Doors thudded, a cough, the clatter of a bucket. She felt their eyes before she heard them, felt the story forming that would not include her. If the stallion charged, it would be proof of her folly. If he fled, it would be proof of her insignificance. Either way, the judgment was prepared. The central conflict pressed close, not between woman and animal, but between who she had been allowed to be and who she was choosing to become. Mara took 1 step forward. The stallion flicked an ear. Another step, and her pulse sounded loud as rain. She did not speak. Words were a net here, and she had come without nets. She remembered a different morning, years earlier, when she had walked away from a fight, because walking away was safer. The memory burned now, a clean heat that asked for payment. She took a 3rd step, close enough to feel the animal's breath change, close enough that fear could finish its sentence. The stallion stamped once, a punctuation mark. The sound traveled the fence line, gathered witnesses. Mara stopped. The ground was cold through her boots. She lowered herself to sit, slow as a leaf finding water, and placed her palms flat against the dirt. The gesture surprised even her. It said she would not chase, would not corner, would not ask the horse to become smaller, so she could feel larger. The stallion's neck arched, then softened. He did not retreat. He watched. Time lengthened. Somewhere a hawk cried. Mara's legs went numb, and she welcomed the numbness because it anchored her to the moment. She breathed with intention, long and open, and felt her body become an offering rather than an argument. The stallion stepped once, testing the space she had given. His hoof landed within arm's reach, and the earth answered with a dull thud that felt like a drumbeat inside her ribs. A man laughed behind her, sharp and quick, already regretted. Another voice murmured her name as a warning. Mara did not turn. Turning would fracture the thin bridge she had laid with patience. The stallion's eyes softened, not with trust yet, but with curiosity that outweighed threat. He lowered his head, mane falling like night over his brow, and the space between them narrowed until the air itself felt held. Mara lifted 1 hand, not to touch, but to exist. The stallion's nostrils flared. He inhaled her story without language. The careful work, the swallowed anger, the longing to be seen without performance. His whiskers brushed her knuckles, a whisper of contact that rewrote the morning. The ranch went silent. Even the wind paused, as if listening. In that quiet, something broke open. The stallion exhaled, a long release, and placed his forehead against her shoulder. The weight surprised her, steady and warm, a trust given without paperwork or witnesses. Mara closed her eyes. The world narrowed to the sound of breathing shared, to the simple truth that she had not been chosen because she demanded it, but because she had waited. A shout cut the air. Too late to stop what had already happened. The stallion lifted his head, alert, muscles coiling for a heartbeat. Mara felt the old fear surge, the instinct to retreat. Instead, she stayed. She remained seated, palms open, spine straight. The stallion wavered, then stood his ground. He chose stillness. The choice rippled outward, silencing the voices, rearranging the room of belief the ranch had built. When Mara finally rose, her legs shook, but she did not hide it. The stallion stepped with her, matching her pace, a shadow learning its source. Someone dropped a bucket. Someone else laughed again, softer this time, amazed. Mara turned then, meeting their eyes, not defiant, not apologetic, simply present. The respect she had chased arrived quietly, like dusk, undeniable and earned. As the sun climbed, the stallion moved beside her toward the open gate. No rope bound him. No hand guided him. He walked because he chose to, because the morning had changed its mind about what was possible. Mara felt the shift settle inside her, a new gravity. She did not know what would come next, only that the path had opened and that she would not step aside again. At the gate, the stallion halted, lifted his head, and answered the valley with a cry that split the morning clean. The sound carried defiance and welcome together, and the people felt it pass through them like weather. Mara opened the gate. He crossed the threshold without haste, wildness intact, allegiance freely given. Applause never came. What rose instead was belief, fragile and fierce, and it was enough. That belief would demand courage collectively. Winter settled without ceremony, a clean white patience that softened the ranch and tested every promise made in the heat of autumn. Snow pressed the land into quiet agreement, and Mara learned the weight of days measured by breath and hoofprint. The stallion, whom she never named, moved with the cold as if it were an old language he had not forgotten. He followed her without tether, not close enough to claim, not far enough to deny, a living question that asked what she would do when attention faded and work remained. The ranch hands changed first in small ways that pretended to be nothing. They waited before speaking. They watched her hands. They let her set the pace. The stallion stood as witness to this recalibration, a dark line against the snow, his presence turning arguments into considerations. Mara felt the shift and resisted the urge to savor it. Respect that needed savoring was brittle. She focused instead on the rhythm she could keep. Water warmed, feed measured, fences mended before they failed. The days held, and so did she. Word traveled the way weather does, carried by mouths that could not help themselves. A boy arrived with his mother. The boy's shoulders locked tight, as if he were holding the world together by force. He did not look at the stallion, and the stallion did not approach him. Mara showed the boy how to stand with his feet planted and his hands empty. They stood together in the cold, the stallion grazing nearby, and nothing happened except the boy's breathing slowed. It was enough to bring them back the next day. Others followed, not in a rush but in a trickle that respected the land's capacity. A man who slept poorly and spoke, less watched from the fence, until his nights grew longer and quieter. A girl with a laugh that arrived to quickly learn to wait for it. Mara did not call it healing. She called it time, offered honestly, without guarantee. The stallion learned these visitors as weather learns a valley, noticing patterns, choosing when to shelter and when to stand. One afternoon, a storm gathered without warning, the sky bruising low and fast. The ranch men moved to secure gates, voices raised against the wind. A rope snapped. The stallion lifted his head, ears sharp, body tightening toward flight. The boy stood frozen near the paddock, fear locking his knees. Mara felt the moment tip, the old story ready to repeat. Chaos proving every doubt. She moved toward the boy, not the horse, and placed herself between fear and its exit. She did not shout. She did not grab. She breathed and waited, letting the storm show its teeth without answering. The stallion circled once, twice, then stopped. Snow cut sideways. The boy's breath hitched. Mara knelt, slow as before, and pressed her palms into ground. The storm howled. The stallion stepped closer, his body a wall of warmth against the wind. He stood between the boy and the open field, a decision made without rehearsal. The ranch fell silent, hands stilled, Voices swallowed. The storm passed as storms do, all bluster and brief violence, leaving the land intact and changed. Afterward, no one spoke of miracles. They spoke of shelter and timing, and the sense that something had been learned without being taught. Mara felt the truth settle deeper, that leadership could be quiet and still rearrange a room. The stallion accepted an apple from a boy's open palm and moved on, the exchange complete and uncelebrated. Spring loosened the ground. Mud returned, honest and unavoidable. The ranch expanded its hours without announcing ambition. A schedule formed because people returned. Mara built nothing that could not be undone, resisted naming what she feared would become an expectation. The stallion ranged wider now, returning at dusk, a daily choice that felt like a vow renewed. When she worried she was leaning too hard on his presence, he drifted farther, teaching her again about balance. A letter arrived from the county, polite and cautious, asking questions that hinted at oversight. Mara read it twice and folded it cleanly. She did not rush to defend what had grown. She invited them instead, set chairs beneath a cottonwood, brewed coffee strong enough to argue with. The stallion grazed nearby, uninterested in permission. The official spoke, listened, and spoke again. They left with less certainty than they brought and more respect than they expected. Sometimes the world adjusted because it had been allowed to witness. On a clear morning, the boy climbed onto the fence rail. Without flinching, he did not mount the stallion. He sat, swinging his legs, telling Mara about a dream that had stayed. She listened. The stallion stood close, his flank brushing the fence, steady as a sentence finished well. The boy's mother watched, hands clasped, eyes bright and tired. The ranch breathed. That evening, as light thinned and the valley took on its long shadows, Mara walked to the far gate where this had begun. The stallion followed, and then moved ahead, stopping at the threshold. He turned his head, one eye on her, waiting. Mara felt the old ache for proof rise and pass. She opened the gate and stepped back. The stallion crossed and did not look behind him. He paused at the river's edge, drank, and lifted his head to the widening sky. Mara watched, heart full and unclaimed, understanding at last that respect was not something she could earn by force or patience alone. It arrived when she aligned her work with her nature and let others meet her there. The stallion returned at dusk, as he always did, and stood beside her without touching. The valley held them both, and the future felt wide enough to enter together, quietly. The first real summer arrived as a test disguised as abundance. Grass rose thick and bright. The river ran quick with melt, and the ranch filled with people who carried their own weather inside them. Mara learned the sound of hope when it tries not to ask for too much. It moved like a footstep held at the edge of a room, waiting to see if it would be welcomed or turned away. She answered the same way she answered everything now, by making space and refusing spectacle. The stallion changed in summerlight. His wildness did not soften, but it clarified. He stood taller, moved farther, returned later. Children watched him with reverence that did not need instruction. Adults watched Mara instead, curious about a leadership that did not announce itself. She noticed how often she was no longer questioned, how decisions seemed to find her without force. The respect she had once starved for now arrived daily, and she learned the discipline of receiving it without bending toward it. One afternoon, heat pressed the valley flat, and the ranch gathered for a reason no one named. A girl arrived in a wheelchair, her hands curled inward as if guarding something fragile. Her father pushed her with a care that bordered on apology. He spoke little. His eyes asked permission before his mouth did. Mara nodded and showed him the shade beneath the cottonwood. The stallion stood at a distance, ears forward, considering. The girl watched him without blinking. Her breath came shallow, a rhythm learned through caution. Mara did not suggest anything. She waited. Time moved the way it does when something important is deciding whether to happen. The stallion stepped closer, then stopped. The girl's fingers twitched. Her father's hands tightened on the chair. The world leaned in. Mara felt the old fear stir, the fear of being responsible for disappointment, for harm, for the moment that would undo everything built carefully over seasons. She let it pass through her, without obedience. She stepped back, widening the circle, and lowered herself to the ground. The stallion closed the distance on his own. He stood so near the girl could feel his warmth. He did not bow his head. He did not retreat. He waited. The girl lifted her chin. Her eyes filled, not with tears yet, but with something brighter and more dangerous. She raised one hand, effort visible in every inch of movement. The stallion did not flinch. When her fingers brushed his mane, the sound she made was small and raw, a breath that turned into a syllable and then into a word that had not been spoken in years. It was not his name. It was not anyone's. It was simply sound reclaiming space. The valley answered with silence, so complete it felt earned. The father sank to his knees, the chair forgotten. Someone laughed and then covered their mouth. Mara closed her eyes and felt the moment settle. Heavy and sweet, the way truth does when it cannot be argued. The stallion lowered his head at last, a courtesy, and the girl rested her palm against his neck, steady as a promise kept. Afterward, the ranch did not erupt into celebration. It absorbed the moment and went on working, which felt like the highest honor it could give. The girl returned, and then others did too, carrying stories that were lighter for being shared. The stallion accepted them all without becoming a symbol. He remained what he had always been, a presence that invited honesty. As summer thinned, Mara felt the pull of reflection. She walked the fence lines at dusk, checking posts that no longer leaned, touching what smoothed by weather and hands. She thought of the morning she had sat in the dirt and waited. She understood now that the choice had not been about the horse at all. It had been about refusing to abandon herself again. On the last warm evening before the nights turned, the ranch gathered quietly. No speeches were planned. Lanterns were lit because darkness arrived. The stallion stood at the edge of the circle, watching, choosing proximity without surrender. Mara looked at the people who had found their way here and felt a gratitude that did not need words. When the lanterns were blown out one by one, the stars took their places, indifferent and generous. Later, when everyone had gone, Mara returned to the far gate. The stallion followed, as he always did, and stopped beside her. She rested her forehead briefly against his shoulder, a gesture that asked nothing. The river moved. The land breathed. She knew the work would continue, imperfect and necessary. She knew she would be tested again. But she also knew this. Respect had come when she stopped seeking it and started standing where she belonged. The stallion turned toward the dark and walked. And she walked with him, not behind, not ahead, but alongside, into a future wide enough to hold them both. Time did what it always does when it is allowed to work honestly. It braided days into meaning. Years moved through the valley with a gentler hand than anyone expected, leaving behind evidence rather than promises. The ranch no longer felt like a place that needed explaining. It existed the way rivers do, shaped by use, defined by return. People arrived quietly and left change in ways they often discovered later, in moments that surprised them while washing dishes or waking from untroubled sleep. Mara aged into herself. Lines formed at the corners of her eyes, earned by sun and attention, not regret. She spoke even less than before, but when she did, her words carried weight because they were never rushed. She learned when to step forward and when to let the work speak. Children who had once hovered at the fence now moved confidently through the paddocks, their bodies looser, their laughter slower and more real. Adults learned to sit without filling the air. The ranch taught them that. The stallion remained unclaimed by anything except choice. His coat silvered slightly with time, his movements still precise, still watchful. He came and went, sometimes absent for days, always returning when dusk softened the edges of the land. Visitors asked about him in hushed tones, as if he were a legend that might overhear. Mara answered simply, he was here because he wanted to be. That truth settled arguments faster than explanation ever could. One evening, long after the last group had gone, a storm rolled in without drama. No one scrambled. The buildings held. The fences stood. Mara walked to the far paddock. As rain began, the sound familiar and clean. The stallion waited near the cottonwood, head lowered, mane darkened by water. She stopped a few steps away, respecting the old boundary that had never truly been a boundary at all. She thought of the woman she had been, the one who arrived early to avoid being seen, who mistook endurance for invisibility. She felt tenderness for that version of herself now, not pity. Survival had been a language she spoke fluently once. Purpose was a language she had learned here, word by word, through patience and refusal to abandon what felt true. The stallion stepped closer. He pressed his forehead lightly against her shoulder, a greeting that carried memory without weight. Mara rested her hand against his neck, fingers warm beneath the rain. No witnesses remained. No transformation waited to be proven. The moment existed only because it wanted to. In the distance, a light flicked on in the main house where someone new was staying. Someone who had arrived carrying questions and would leave carrying steadier breath. Mara smiled, small and unguarded. She understood now that the work would never be finished, and that was not a failure. It was an invitation. The rain eased. The stallion lifted his head and looked toward the darkening hills. Mara followed his gaze. Whatever waited there did not frighten her anymore. She had learned that respect was not taken or granted, but grown. Slowly, stubbornly, through alignment with what mattered. She opened the gate, as she always did, and stepped aside. Now, click on the video on the screen to hear a story even more miraculous than this one. You'll cry, and then feel whole again. Click it now, we'll be waiting. The valley did not remember beginnings the way people did. It remembered patterns, where water gathered after rain, where hooves pressed paths into stubborn ground, where silence was allowed to linger without being corrected. Long after the ranch had settled into its quiet reputation, those patterns continued to deepen, and Mara understood that legacy was not a monument but a way of moving through ordinary days. She noticed it first in herself. Decisions came without the old tremor. When conflict surfaced, she had not braced for it like an incoming storm. She let it pass through conversation and labor, trusting that clarity would arrive as she stayed present. The ranch reflected the steadiness back to her. Problems were solved early. Needs were named before they hardened into wounds. People learned to listen to what was unsaid because they had learned here that silence was not empty. The stallion aged into a kind of quiet authority that did not seek center stage. His presence reorganized space wherever he stood. Newcomers sensed it immediately, the way animals sometimes do, and adjusted themselves without knowing why. He no longer startled at sudden movement. He no longer needed distance to feel safe. Yet he never lost the edge of wildness that had first drawn Mara to him. That edge remained, sharp and honest, a reminder that peace did not require surrender. One autumn afternoon, a young woman arrived alone, her car packed badly, belongings shifting with every stop. She said little about why she had come. She did not need to. Mara recognized the posture. Shoulders curved inward, eyes measuring exits. She showed her a place to sleep, a place to work, a place to sit when sitting felt impossible. The stallion watched from the fence, uninterested but aware. Days passed. The woman found rhythm in feeding and cleaning, in walking perimeter at dusk. One evening, she lingered by the paddock longer than necessary. The stallion approached and stopped a careful distance away. The woman did not move. She stood with her hands loose at her sides, breath shallow but steady. Mara watched from afar and felt a familiar tightening in her chest. Not fear this time, but recognition. The work was repeating itself, not as imitation, but as inheritance. When the woman finally turned away, her face held something new, an expression not of relief, but of permission. She did not need to explain it. Mara understood. Some moments did not ask to be translated. They asked only to be respected. That night, Mara walked the ranch alone. The stars were sharp, the air cool enough to sting. She stopped where the fence met the open land and rested her arms on the top rail. She thought about how often she had been told once that she needed to be louder, tougher, more certain to be taken seriously. She smiled at the memory without bitterness. The truth had been simpler and harder. She had needed to stay. The stallion approached and stood beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth through her coat. They watched the valley together, the way they had learned to do, not scanning for danger, not anticipating applause, just bearing witness. The ranch behind them held its breath and then released it, a living thing content with its shape. Mara knew she would not always be here. Bodies change. Seasons insisted. But the work did not depend on her permanence. It depended on the rules she had learned to honor. Listen first, move slowly, never force what could be invited. Those rules had taken root deeper than her own footsteps. They lived now in other hands, other pauses, other quiet choices made at the right moment. The stallion shifted his weight and stepped away, heading toward the river path, confident she would not follow unless invited. Mara watched him go, heart full without strain. She turned back toward the lights of the ranch, where someone was laughing softly, where another long night of ordinary healing was already underway. The future did not feel dramatic. It felt open, and that was enough. Morning returned the way it always had. Unannounced, patient, certain it would be received. Mist rested low along the river, turning the valley into a softened sketch, and the ranch woke slowly without urgency. Mara moved through it with the ease of someone who no longer needed to arrive early to be invisible. She was simply present, and that presence had become part of the land's rhythm. The stallion stood near the waterline, his reflection broken by ripples that caught the light and let it go. He lifted his head when she approached, acknowledging her without ceremony. There was no moment to prove anymore, no threshold waiting to be crossed. What had once been fragile between them had settled into something durable, shaped by years of choosing and being chosen again. A small group gathered near the barn. People had come and stayed. People who had come and left pieces of themselves behind in the best way. They spoke quietly, sharing coffee, sharing the kind of stories that no longer needed urgency to feel important. Mara listened more than she spoke. She had learned that listening was not absence, but a form of leadership that invited others to arrive fully. One of the children, taller now, steadier, ran past, boots thudding against packed earth. The sound carried laughter, not escape. Mara felt it land somewhere deep and permanent. She remembered how many times she had once mistaken speed for strength, noise for certainty. The ranch had taught her otherwise. Strength could be slow. Certainty could breathe. The stallion moved closer, close enough that she could feel the familiar heat of him at her side. His mane had thinned slightly with age, his eyes softened at the edges, but the wildness remained intact, bright and unnegotiable. He had never belonged to her, and that had been the point all along. What they shared was not ownership but alignment, a shared refusal to be reduced. Mara rested her hand against the fence and watched the people move through the space they had helped shape together. No signs announced what the ranch was. No promises were made at the gate. And yet, those who entered felt it almost immediately. The permission to slow down, to be unfinished, to heal without performance. The work continued because it was needed, not because it was praised. As the sun climbed higher, the day opened fully. Someone called her name, not sharply, not with doubt, just to ask a simple question. She answered without hesitation. The sound of her own voice felt steady, unforced. Respect had woven itself into the ordinary exchanges, invisible and strong. Later, when the afternoon leaned toward evening, Mara returned once more to the far fence. The stallion followed, and then stopped beside her, matching her stillness. Together, they watched the light shift, watched the valley accept another day without asking it to be different than it was. Mara understood now that the story would continue long after her footsteps faded from these paths. Others would sit in the dirt and wait. Others would learn the courage of not turning away. The legacy was not the ranch, nor the horse, nor even her own quiet transformation. It was a practice of choosing presence over fear, patience over force, belief over proof. The stallion turned toward the darkening hills, ears forward, attentive to a future that did not need naming. Mara stayed where she was, content to let him go and certain he would return. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the sound of water and breathing things and lives continuing. She closed her eyes for a moment and fell whole, not because everything was finished, but because nothing important had been abandoned. Evening settled with the confidence of something that had done this before. The sky dimmed into layers of blue and ash, and the ranch slipped into its softer voice. Lamps blinked on one by one, not to push back the dark, but to live alongside it. Mara walked the familiar paths without counting steps, her body remembering what her mind no longer questioned. She had become part of the landscape she once feared would reject her. The stallion stood near the ridge where land tilted gently toward open country. His silhouette cut clean against the last light, unmistakable even now. He had grown older, but age had only clarified him. Every movement carried intention. Every pause meant something. He turned when Mara reached him, and for a moment they regarded each other the way they always had. Without demand, without ownership, without needing to find what this connection was allowed to be. Below them, the ranch breathed. A door closed softly. Someone laughed, tired and genuine. Somewhere a child slept more deeply than they had in years. None of it asked for attention, and that was a quiet miracle of it all. Healing here had never been loud. It had been consistent. Mara thought of the long arc that had brought her to this ridge. The mornings of doubt, the afternoons of resistance, the nights when she had wondered if staying had been a mistake. She remembered how respect had once felt like a locked gate she could never quite reach. Now she understood it had never been locked at all. It had been waiting for her to stop asking permission. The stallion stepped closer and stood shoulder to shoulder with her. Their shadows touching before the light disappeared entirely. He did not lean. He did not retreat. He simply was. Mara felt a swell of gratitude that surprised her with its steadiness. Not gratitude for success or recognition or even transformation, but for alignment, for the rare gift of living in a way that did not require apology. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of grass and water and distant rain. The stallion lifted his head, listening to something beyond human hearing. Mara followed his gaze, not trying to see what he saw, only trusting that it existed. Whatever waited out, there did not feel like a threat anymore. It felt like continuation. She rested her hand briefly against his neck, a familiar warmth anchoring the moment. Then she stepped back. The stallion turned toward the open land and began to walk, unhurried, certain of his direction. Mara watched until his shape dissolved into dusk, until the ridge held only memory and wind. She did not feel loss. She felt completion, layered with promise. She turned back toward the lights of the ranch, toward the work that would always remain unfinished in the best way. Tomorrow someone would arrive, carrying a story heavy enough to change them. Tomorrow patience would be required again. Tomorrow belief would be tested, and she would meet it, quietly, fully, without turning away. Now, click on the video on the screen to hear a story even more miraculous than this one. You'll cry and then feel whole again. Click it now, we'll be waiting.